It's a great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Michael Hayman. I'm the honorary professor of the Purpose Economy at the School of Advanced Studies, and I also present a podcast called Changemakers, and I co-authored a book called Mission, which definitely did look at the digital side of this in terms of the rise of the platforms, many of which are so important to the digital record. One of the interviews we did in the book was with Jimmy Wales, who many will know as the founder of Wikipedia. And he said something that I always thought was so interesting in terms of just the rise of digital and its effect on, I guess, the story of the human experience. If it isn't on Google, it doesn't exist. And I think this question about the digital record and the role of humanities as part of that is such an important one in our ability to understand ourselves, being human in a digital age, and that experience therein. Of course, the backdrop to today is also the pandemic, which has supercharged the digital divide globally and indeed very locally as well. And it got me thinking that if Charles Dickens was alive today, he might be writing a tale of two lockdowns at the moment, both in terms of the digital experience, but I think also the lockdown experience. And the humanities, of course, have been at the brunt of that. I think we've done everything as societies around the world to keep science and technology on the road. But of course, the primary way that humanities have traditionally taught, through our libraries, through our universities, have been ultimately locked down, and it's had major consequences in the way that learning has been conducted. And of course, we've learned new things about ourselves, both for better and for ill, and I'm sure our panelists will want to pick up on that. So tonight is a 1 hour discussion, an ability to hear from a really esteemed panel I'll introduce momentarily. It would be great to get as many questions as we can going. Just to give a few thoughts on the kind of housekeeping. The panel is being recorded. The event is also being live captioned. And if you want to follow that, if you click on the CC Live transcript button, which is next to the reactions tab at the bottom, you'll be able to do that. I also want to tell you that it's not AI, it's actually one of our great team who is going to be transcribing what's being said. Also, last week we had a superb student-led discussion on Twitter, and we're going to continue with the hashtag from that, which is Open Digital Discussion. Many of those students are listening in. I'm going to pull out one or two of the questions to the panelists for the discussion a little bit later. But what we'd also like is to really encourage questions from the floor this evening or this afternoon or this morning. So do use the Q&A box, which is bottom center right, rather than the live chat box. So if you can use the Q&A, then I can bring those up. It would be great to bring that together. I'm going to invite our speakers to provide an opening round of a couple of minutes each in terms of observations on the topic of digital access, inclusion, and the humanities. They're a super group. Roopika Risam is an associate professor at Salem State University, who describes herself as a public scholar and a digital humanist. She said that the emergence of digital humanities has been heralded for its commitment to openness, access, and the democratizing of knowledge, but it raises a number of questions about emissions with respect to race, gender, sexuality, disability, and nation. Gabriela Baeza Ventura is an associate professor of Spanish at the University of Houston. Her approach is a humanistic one. She says, by using a humanistic approach to all that we do, language, history, philosophy, ethics, art, we recovered our past in order to make a more inclusive future. Bethany Nowviskie is a Dean of Libraries and Professor of English at James Madison University in Virginia. She's described digital humanities as the ability for anyone, not just scholars, but citizens, community organizers, to get a message out to a wider audience in fairly unmoderated ways. And Anasuya Sengupta describes herself as a feminist advocate, strategist, grant maker, and storyteller for communities and organizations, having led initiatives in India, the US, and across the Southern Hemisphere for 20 years saying that the internet is not representative of all groups. If access means only seeing one particular version of knowledge and version of the world, that is not truly global. Well, we have a truly global discussion here today, and I'm going to ask Roopika to kick us off with her opening thoughts, and then we're going to move on to the other speakers and then opening up to questions. Roopika, your thoughts.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to Dr. Winters and Dr. Wells for the opportunity to be here, and to my fellow panelists as well. So as I've argued in my book, New Digital Worlds, if we're not carefully attending to the ways that that colonialism and racial capitalism have shaped the content of the cultural record, so what has and hasn't been preserved in archives, and the investments in what does and doesn't get digitized, then digital humanities is at risk of not only reproducing, but also amplifying the hallmarks of colonialism and racial capitalism that and the canon as we construct the digital cultural record. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really demonstrated why this is crucial. Graduate students, contingent faculty, and pre-tenure faculty whose methods include archival research are at the mercy of uneven access to archives at these very crucial, vulnerable moments in their careers. And if they're fortunate enough that their topics are canonical, there's a stronger likelihood that they can continue their research, but that's been a lot harder for those who are working on topics that are non-canonical, particularly those related to Black and Brown Indigenous communities, whose cultural heritage hasn't received the same kind of investment in digitization and access. And despite the fact that many committed thinkers, like my co-panelists, have been advocates for and participants in this work for so many years, the inequities remain. And so the question here is really, what can we do about this, particularly at a moment when our institutions, like our libraries and our universities and archives and others that are undertaking the vital work of preservation and dissemination of cultural heritage, are most vulnerable to the brutal economic realities of the pandemic. And for me, this is a question of labor. We only have access to the digital cultural record because of the work of archivists and librarians and other cultural heritage workers who've been responsible for accessioning and creating metadata, producing digital surrogates, and maintaining the infrastructure for access. And even if they're employed by universities, largely they don't have the relative job protection that tenure affords. And many of our universities in the US, and I know from talking to Dr. Winters, this is happening in the UK as well, we're facing reorganization and layoffs. And for wealthier institutions, the pandemic has become a good cover for gutting what leadership perceives to be less valuable or less profitable. And for underfunded universities like mine, the pandemic has accelerated a financial reckoning that was going to come in a few years. It's just coming faster. And as a department chair and as a faculty fellow for digital library initiatives, I've been at the seat for these conversations and played out these thought experiments about how do we cut $250,000 from my budget, or a conversation with the library dean about how do we get $1 million out of her budget. And when you do that with a perspective that's grounded in the humanities and in the digital humanities, the conclusions look a lot different than if you're doing it as a chief financial officer who's staring at a balance sheet. And where the CFO sees the library as a cost center rather than a revenue generator, we're really thinking about what are a different set of metrics that make the case for a different kind of capital, to speak CFO language, that demonstrates this crucial contribution to the humanities and to humanity, and that there are ways to understand revenue in ways that are harder to capture than simply tuition dollars coming in. And I've only actually had 2 wins in these discussions, but it's a real challenge. So I just want to stop on this thought that one crucial answer is that we need humanists in positions of academic leadership to make these arguments. And we have a really great example here in Bethany of why this is so important. Digital humanists in particular are actually well suited to this role because we've had to work collaboratively, we've had to manage people and deal with budgets and navigate arcane institutional bureaucracies. And we really need more Black, Brown, and Indigenous humanists in these roles who can speak to the ways that the decisions around value are not colorblind, but have material effects on the world.
Thank you very much, Roopika. But can we move on to Gabby, your opening thoughts, please?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Again, Dr. Wells and Dr. Winters, this is a magnificent opportunity for us to have this important conversation. I'm right now rooted in Houston, Texas, and for those who are not familiar with what Texas just recently went through was one of the most horrendous climatic events that we've had in our lives in 100 years. We had, we endured temperatures of 10, 20 degrees. The capitalist system that we're in allowed CEOs and CFOs of the electric companies to shut off our electricity for 24 hours, 36 hours at a time. So right now we're having to deal with that, as well as issues that relate to the pandemic. And so as we were preparing for these opening remarks, Dr. Hayman asked us to think about like the now, like where we're at. And so my present right now is I'm coming, from that, where when I shared my my video, I was talking about, communities that are not represented, communities that don't have access to internet. And so we came to a moment last week where none of us in Texas had access to internet. We rely so much, right, on the electricity to provide, daily services for a daily living. And so this, unfortunately for many people here in Houston, this became a deathly situation where many people have died. They're in situations where they can't even afford to fix their homes, and they were put in a situation where they had to combine people in homes so that they could survive, this winter situation. And so again, like my colleague Roopika mentioned, it's important that we have people who have experienced some of these situations, who are at the moment, who are in positions to make decisions. A lot of times decisions are made for the community without the community in mind. These are decisions that are brought in from the top down, that never really actually trickle down to the bottom, and they're thought in a very paternalistic way. And so my position here is always to be mindful and to question ourselves, where are we, why are we making these decisions, on behalf of who, and are they really benefiting the communities, right? It is important that we have people who are humanists in administrative positions, but also when these people are put in administrative positions, to not tie their hands. It is very easy to tokenize these representatives for us, and in the end, they end up turning them into people who are no longer allies to us, because their hands are so tight that they end up having to pick and choose which communities are going to be served. In the United States, we are always often replacing one minority group with another. And that's a shame. That is a shame, a shame, a shame on all of us, because in the end, nobody benefits. And we see it, I see it through my work. And that is why, we have a lot of grassroots community work. We do a lot of work with empowering our own communities in multiple languages, so that the community itself learns that they have the tools, that they are valuable, that their stories matter, and that they should be making those demands from the ground up. And yes, unfortunately, we are riddled with these archaic and useless infrastructure and administrative systems that are there for the benefit of the few, as it was clearly proven to me just last week, with the situation that we endured. And so those are my thoughts. It continue I think in this situation, what we have to do is we need to continue to empower ourselves, our communities, to take those deep breaths, to think, how is it that we can continue and to move forward? And every little bit counts. And support the administrators, our allies who are at the top, who are willing to help us and see, which ways in which, and we can collaborate. But I still, maybe I'm an optimist, but I think it's still a movement that comes from the community, from empowering ourselves at the ground, from the ground up, and putting pressure.
Thank you very much, Gabby. Bethany, your opening thoughts, please.
Thank you. Yes, and Gabby, I think that was so well said. Similarly, I want to give a perspective today that's grounded in my own institutional situation here and in the current moment in which we find ourselves. And I think chiefly important for me to mention is the fact that the library system that I represent here at James Madison University has responsibility not just for access to content, so to archival materials, print collections from a wide variety of communities, digital collections, including new media, audiovisual materials, all that kind of thing, databases, e-resources. But we also provide the teaching and learning tools, the educational technology infrastructure, and the instructional design expertise that helps our campus function as a modern university. So, always hybrid, even when we are in normal times and think of ourselves as residential and face-to-face, our faculty are augmenting our students' experiences with technology. But of course, in this pandemic year, we have been, as so many institutions, unexpectedly in much larger part online. And having that sort of twofold responsibility has put us here in the libraries in a good position to observe anew the intersection of educational technology and scholarly communication, and to grapple with access challenges for our students and our faculty that sometimes blend, sometimes in unproductive ways, between content and platform. And I think it's given us a special responsibility too to make good on what we've learned this year about the fault lines of inequity that exist even in the privileged context in which we work, fault lines that have always existed, but which have been more easily obscured to a wider array of faculty and administrators than they are now. They're more easily seen now. And those have to do with simple access to necessary equipment, to Wi-Fi, to safe and stable places to be when you're living and learning in the same spot. And they also relate to the differential experiences with technology that people have, to the harm that is done by our platforms and tools to people of color, to queer and trans folks, to all the people for whom those ed tech systems were really patently not designed. And as my own role in academic libraries has evolved over time, I have come to, I'm gonna use that word, Roopsie. I have come to understand that it's all about power and capital and where you place them. Where, if you are lucky enough to have some influence, to be able to direct resources where you choose to place those resources. And so leveraging our power, especially when that power is unearned and imbalanced, and understanding our university budgets as moral documents that reflect in the most revealing way what we value, that is how we move the needle on core issues of equity and inclusion more broadly in our institutions and society as a whole, and particularly in the fields of scholarly communication and educational technologies. It's the same. It's our particular responsibility to place our investments wisely with a progressive and a values-driven attitude toward transformational and transformative access, to place those investments in the tools, the educational platforms, the collaborative information ecosystems that are the most healthy, the most promising, that are the most welcoming, are not just like middlingly benign, but are actively anti-racist, and that are built by communities to uplift their people and that are protective of the folks that we need to be in more caring and conscious interrelationships with. And if we have more time to get back to it, I have a few things that I'd love to say about Afrofuturism and time in digital libraries and how I think those connect to the themes that we have today.
Definitely come back to that, but thank you very much for that, Bethany. Just to say, some people are raising hands and putting stuff in the chat box. If you can put it in the Q&A, then I can actually sort of ask the questions on your behalf, because I can't come to you with this sort of Zoom webinar that we've got at the moment. But Anasuya, your opening thoughts, please.
It's such a pleasure to be here, even when being is sitting in your home in a fragmented sort of way, in front of some Zoom screen or the other. And really a pleasure to be in conversation with people who are inspirations and co-conspirators in so many different things, old friends and new. So thank you for bringing us together. I'm the only non-academic on this panel. And so for me, I'm going to step back a little and talk about what this feels like in practice for me and for my communities, and particularly as someone who, like Gabriela and Roopika possibly, are diasporic. So I come from India, I grew up in India, I moved to the United States for the past 12 years of my life, and then moved to London a year and some ago, just in time for stirring events like Brexit and elections and COVID. And it's been really interesting for me to be in London, in the heart of my empire, and sort of reflect on what that means for the work that I do and the work we do at Whose Knowledge. So as you've all said so beautifully, and I think, Roopika, your thread of power and capital, and Gabby pulling it into lived experience, and Bethany into the infrastructures that sort of underlie this. I want to affirm all of that and say that for me, what capital does is prioritize. It tells us what values and what priorities we give to what things. And that is what a colonial capitalist industrial complex has given us. We know immediately who is prioritized, what is prioritized, how it is prioritized, when it is prioritized. And from the point of view of digital infrastructure, it's interesting because every time I offer this data, and this is part of my spiel, people are surprised, but nearly 60% of the world is digitally connected. The question is how? What is that connectivity actually like? It's not sitting with a laptop with broadband and Wi-Fi. Most of those who are connected are from the Global South. In fact, 3/4 of those who are online today, digitally connected today by the internet and through the internet, are from the Global South, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Islands. And most of those are connected via mobile devices. So even when we talk access, we're talking mobile. When we're talking access, as Gabby put so beautifully, it starts with, do you have electricity? How often do you have electricity? Then what kind of device do you have? Who gets access to that device for how long? And then the question that we ask at Whose Knowledge is, what do you find once you're online? So it's both about infrastructures of connectivity and it's infrastructures of information and knowledge. Those two are connected. Access is not a simple on and off button, as I said in the video that we were talking about. So if, nearly half of all women are online, 3/4 of those who are online are from the Global South, why do we not see ourselves in the internet once we're online, when we can be online? So part of that, I think, has been sort of shown to us through COVID in what we're calling, I call it the brutal gifts of COVID, which is that exactly as COVID has shown us how you can have a collective experience, but you don't experience it the same. It's as feminist principles have told us over and over again, equality is not sameness. So the collective is not sameness. Just as we have experienced it differently based on race, on class, on age, on geography, on language, so too do we experience the internet. And so the question for me then is, if we are to talk about access, how do we broaden the conversation, not just to the access of the physical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure that allows us to be in conversation with each other, but then whose stories are told, whose histories are seen, whose knowledges are shared, whose faces lead us, whose design is this world of the online, of the digital, whose leadership and design is centered in this. And so those are the questions that I'm hoping we'll unpack as well along with it. And I think as the non-academic who is a co-conspirator with many of you, especially in the digital humanities, I think the reason that the humanities is so key is because COVID has also shown us that the two important principles of how we're coping with what we're going through is infrastructures of care and infrastructures of creativity. And there's no other space that exemplifies both care and creativity, I think, than the humanities, whether as a discipline or as a set of values. So I'm going to stop there and come back to some of this when we go around again.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you to everyone for their opening remarks. And I think I'm just picking up on the questions we're getting and the chat, and it ranges from really how are we going to go forward from the study of the humanities in an era of COVID, in an era of the increasing reliance on digital. So some very practical questions about how do panelists see the future, through to bigger questions, which I think speak to larger issues to do with the human experience as we're living it right now, to do with access, to do with inclusion, to do with, I guess, the accelerated consequences of digital itself, but now the pandemic alongside that. And I wondered if what we might do is actually try and split this debate, or sorry, the discussion down to the three areas, and let's start with access. Let's start with this question. I was just Googling while you were speaking, is that the WEF is talking about the Great Reset, and that's not just something we're all doing with our PCs every day. I mean, but this idea that somehow the digital power brokers are being called up the mountain to sort of reset themselves in a global society, in terms of being on the front line of this, in terms of academics that are, I guess, sharing the human experience as opposed to debating it from corporate boards. I mean, we're meeting on a Zoom line. We're meeting on, exactly, I suppose, that the consequences of the work of these technologists. To what degree is digital mending its ways in terms of addressing some of the great accessibility challenges that you're raising? I'd be very interested to sort of get a sort of state of play as people see it, and I would just encourage speakers to do jump in rather than being called upon. But Bethany, I can see you recoil actively when I said that, so I'm going to call on you and then invite others to come in. But let's focus on digital access as it stands right now. I
think what I'm recoiling at is the notion that the power players in industry are, seeing this as any kind of moment of reckoning. I think it's much more accurate to say it's a doubling down on investments that they have already made and on systems that they're already finding are increasingly profitable. And this, again, I want to kind of go back to this this blending that I was talking about earlier between the content providers and the platform providers, because I think that those work in complex interrelation, and we are increasingly. There's a strong strand of resistance in the academy, in the humanities, but also in open science and open educational resources. And so it's beyond the humanities, but there's a strong sort of thread of resistance to the monocultures that we have just about, fallen into and normalized. And so I think this is very much what I was hearing from Anasuya, from Gabby, from Roopika, that we need to bolster that threat of resistance. And what we really need to be doing is not, I think I was making faces because I am concerned about the level of complacency and the lack in so many key areas of deep understanding of the problematic nature of these tools and platforms, but also the economic systems. I mean, we're in the academy, these are prestige economies, which simply means that we decide what we value, to pick up on another theme, and can place our investments accordingly and change the systems, but we are not doing that. And so it's a deep concern to me.
Are there any other perspectives that speakers would offer?
Yes, to follow up on what Bethany said, and also I think this tied into Bethany's remarks in her video. Really, this beginning of the pandemic, at least, was a moment where a lot of tech companies are really doubling down on their predatoriness with faculty. I was in a position where we were understaffed in terms of instructional technology, and we literally had one person. I was on sabbatical, and so they said, can you please come back and help people deal with online teaching? And really, it was not surprising, but so alarming to see how many ed tech vendors were just reaching out to the faculty and claiming, we have your solutions. And, then they'd sort of be coming back to us, and we'd sort of have to vet all of this. And really the issues that we had challenges dealing with were not the issues that were going to be solved by the ed tech vendors. They were issues like, in the US, the state has not taken any responsibility on equal access to internet in rural areas, for example, where, we could give a student a hotspot, but that may not necessarily guarantee that we can give them internet access. And I mean, that's just one case in the US. I feel like this is, because everything's been left to these companies to figure out, and they're making decisions based on what is going to be most effective for their bottom line. It's just exacerbating these issues of access.
Any other perspectives? I've got some questions building up, but I wonder, Anasuya or Gabby, whether you've got a perspective you'd offer.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I'm echoing everything that Bethany and Roopika are saying, but most importantly, thinking about how, we imagine that, these software companies and these technological, advances are really creating some sort of equilibrium, but they really are not, because at the end of the the bottom line is that they're really focusing on on the bottom dollar. However, on the other hand, for organizations such as the one that I represent at the University of Houston with the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Program and Arte Público Press, we have always been at the bottom. We have always been working from the margins, trying to figure out ways in which we can become visible. And so, we have been digitizing, so many things for a long, long time. So this was a perfect opportunity for us to become visible and to become relevant in some sort of way. We were there for a little while. However, now it's been easy. Now it's easy for, now that we exist, there's other different organizations that are coming up to institute programs or subject matter that is canonical again, right? And so we always end up going like Roopsie says, we have to check ourselves consistently. Our training is so colonial, that we always end up reproducing the same patterns. And so we need, the administrators, we need the people that are checking to make sure that these, organizations who are very predatory and they're only focused on the bottom dollar, whoever their advisors are, they need to tell them, hey, wait a minute, pay attention to these other areas, that you have to be mindful of these other voices that are speaking up, because that's what really is going to enhance and will bring in, and even increase your bottom dollar if you really wanted to, right? Yes.
Sorry, you finish your point, Gabby, sorry.
So none of that, this access to technology does not mean equality for everybody. Never. It never does, unless we are checking on ourselves and being adamant about making sure that we are not replicating this existence of colonialism, because we end up, attacking each other.
So, Anasuya, I just wondered, you've paraphrased some of the early discussion as this sort of debate about power and capital. And a lot of, I interview a lot of technology CEOs through my interviewing work, and a lot of them, if they were sat here, would go, look, I'm listening to these guys, and what I can tell you is we're a force for good. We're doing all of these things that are not reflective of what's being said here. Who speaks truth unto power at this moment? Is this the new colonialism that exists in a digital sphere, and you can't address it, or actually is the humanities there to actually provide? What is the role of those that study the human experience in speaking truth unto power, I guess, is my question about this.
So I want to just acknowledge that it was Roopika who started us off on the power and capital thread, which we all agree with. So, this is really a conversation between co-conspirators. I think we're all echoing each other because we feel so strongly and so similarly about these issues. As someone who lives and works at the intersections of tech and social justice, much of my awake and not so awake life, I want to say a couple of things to what you asked, Michael. First, I want to say that I think there are a few cognitive dissonances and fallacies about the way that tech sees itself. And then I will address the digital colonialism piece, which I think we all agree with. One is that there's a notion that these platforms and tech companies are global. What they understand by globality is deeply problematic, because at the end of the day, the way they are designed, their architecture, their infrastructure, and the way they roll out are all about primarily a white, male, straight, Californian or global North perspective and design. If we're lucky and not so lucky, you'll have a few brown men who come from India or South Asia. But it doesn't mean that shifts that architecture and design, because the leadership and the imagination that is involved in tech content and tech platform is not that of the majority of the world. So that is one. That's a deep cognitive dissonance to claim a globality when it is actually a globality of a very particular US and possibly sometimes, but rarely, European perspective. The second cognitive dissonance is to assume that these infrastructures are all about individuals getting access, because it continues with a very capitalist, colonialist, individualist, atomistic version of the world, right? And so the only way that they understand how change and transformation happens is through an individual narrative, the hero narrative, right? And the heroic individual story gets told over and over again in Silicon Valley and then repeated across the internet, but that is not where the resistance is. So to come to your question, I think the resistance is, as we have been saying, in those of us who do two or three things. One, who are very much centered in community and who oppose the view from nowhere, right? We are extremely situated, we're contextual, we're specific, and we say essentially that if you were to design the internet from our perspectives, you would have a completely different architecture, you would have a completely different content, you would have a completely different user experience. What does that internet look like? The second thing, I think, is that because we think of power as dynamic and we recognize it as such, we also recognize that some of our allies and champions are those individuals within these tech companies or within, academia that understand this analysis, but don't quite know how to shift power. And the third piece, which is exactly what Roopika has been talking about, is that there is no binary of offline and online. That is a fallacy, a myth. It does not exist. We are in the political economies of information and knowledge. Our lived experience is both virtual and physical. One affects the other and the other affects the first. And therefore, to recognize that the bottom line of profit does drive the tech company, not necessarily the technologist within the company, but the company itself, its leadership is key. And I'm going to end with just an example, which is very close to my heart and one that is in my now, which is that I come from India. India right now is a country led by a fascist government. It has the most number of internet shutdowns in the world over the last 5 years. So forget even access in the basic way, connectivity does not exist. And yet, if you were to talk to Facebook or Google or any of the big 5 tech companies, they would not say a word against what is happening in India, simply because A, it's too far to care because they're sitting in Silicon Valley. And secondly, Facebook's biggest market is India or Brazil, just as another example, right? So we have to recognize the motivations of companies while also recognizing that pushing them to change has to be something that is multifaceted.
I'm glad we haven't got Mark Zuckerberg on this panel because I'm not sure he'd leave this panel alive. Now, what I want to do is I want to just bring in some questions. There's so many things. I'm desperate to talk about the resistance, but unfortunately, that feels like the sequel to this event. But there are some questions that are coming out of the discussion on access and inclusion. And I'd like to pick up on a question from Daniela Major, who's asked if the panelists could talk a little bit about language barriers on the web, specifically the English as the kind of the main medium. Could I ask that speakers limit themselves to just about a minute or so, because I'd like to get a few more questions in, and we're moving on. But maybe Rupi, maybe you kick us off, and just I'll just would like to get some perspectives on the language barriers, please.
I'd rather actually have Gabby.
Okay.
Gabby would like. She's just this amazing leader on this issue.
Gabby, go for it.
Thank you, Roopsi. So quickly, I'll just say that for us, because we work with Spanish, a lot of materials that were produced in Spanish, we archived many things that were So the recovery program is a program that recovers the written legacy of Latinos in the United States from the colonial period up until 1960. We have hundreds and hundreds of records. About 85% of the materials that we have were written in Spanish, and because they were written in Spanish, they were not necessarily archived, right? And so part of our mission is to always produce our materials bilingually. And so, yes, there's a strong push for doing things in English. However, you can always do things bilingually. So that's what we do. And if the option is not there for us to do it bilingually, we simply do it in Spanish. And people have a lot of access to different technologies that allow them to translate things into English, and we let them go. But our goal is to visualize, to demonstrate that Latinos, the people who are living in the United States were speaking from the colonial period up until now. They speak a variety of languages: English, Spanish, French, Ladino. We have recovered a lot of newspapers that were not only written in just Spanish or English, but a combination of languages. So for us, it is extremely important to visualize that.
I think I don't know if I'm just going to throw in other comments as I'm seeing them come up to talk about this, but there is this issue along with the, so I take that point, by the way, Gabby, about, you know, how things are changing in terms of technology and how it moves forward, and actually how you can neutralize some of the language issues. But there is this sort of a question here about the kind of the global north and neoliberal academia. It's more than just a language issue, that there's a cultural dimension to this as well. I mean, I wonder whether anyone would like to pick up on that.
I just want to add to that also, that in terms of like the global, you know, we're always thinking about, you know, in this Western thought as well, you know, where we're colonized by European languages, and even in the United States, there's a huge backlash against people who speak Spanglish. You know, get over it. You know, if you can understand me, you know, if I say a word and you understand me, then that's how language works, right? And so it's also an opportunity for us to have those discussions and to start breaking down those canonical perspectives about what language is, and understand that language is a living organism, right? And we use it to communicate. I mean, I'm using my hands, you know, I use my eyes to communicate. And so, you know, we need to use it as a tool, as a resource, not as something that should dominate how we think or how we feel, or, you know, because it's extremely powerful for us to empower people. Here in the United States, there have been strong movements of anti-other languages, especially Mexican Spanish. And I am so done with that. You know, every time that somebody speaks Mexican Spanish, it's not something good. But if you speak Spanish with an accent, a European accent, a deep South American accent, that is beautiful. You know, and so we need to get over that ourselves and understand that language is language. And so I know that, you know, there's a whole, you know, academic and archaic, you know, structures that don't allow us to do that. But I think we can be in that movement, and we can start to validate language in that way.
And Gabby, actually, that's exactly along the lines of this point about who designs the systems, who designs the knowledge sharing platforms, the learning platforms, communication platforms. What would they look like? What would they feel like if they were designed with embodied knowledge at the heart? If they were designed in polyvocal and multilingual frameworks, right? If they were really, if we could shift the center of gravity in these systems toward the communities that have indigenous knowledges that they are transmitting and sharing, that are living systems, but that are not getting expression in these other platforms, what would they be like? And so this is, you know, it's been said in a couple of terrific contexts around. I referenced Afrofuturism earlier as a framework that is really inspiring to me in thinking about the necessary redesign of our digital library systems. But a kind of core tenet there is that a true manifestation of a people's autonomy, of their liberty, of the liberatory potential of the environments that they can create themselves, as if they can fashion their own philosophical infrastructure. And that's what we have not enabled. And so I think it's really on point to say that we both need to be in the business of uplift and transfer of energy, capital, power. And we also need to find the people who may be in tech companies, they may be in administrative roles in the academy, they're all over, who want to affect this shift and are seeing sometimes large and sometimes small ways to do it from where they are.
So we have a question from Dr. Roy here, who I suppose, to pick up on Bethany's point, is asking the question, well, how does that happen? How do we, what are the next steps that come that I guess from the perspective of the speakers?
So this ties into this question of kind of the neoliberal ethics of care and neoliberal creativity in the Global North Academy. If it's a hegemonic understanding of what care is, then it's neoliberal. if it's the kind of care that comes out of the kind of polyvocality that Bethany and Gabby have been talking about, that Anasuya's work emphasizes as well, that's very different. And ethics of care isn't about, here is what we need to do to perform some kind of ethics of care. It's about creating the space and creating the structures where people can realize their own ways of thinking and doing and making.
I just want to I want to get onto the future of the humanities as the kind of, I guess, the final part of this, but I just want to just mop up a few of the questions we've got here. We've got an M. Castrillo who apologize, I haven't got your first name on the screen here, but who's asking, do the panelists have any views on the possibilities of a digital burnout once the pandemic recedes? After months of relying heavily and in some cases exclusively on digital technology to enable connectivity, suddenly people turn their back on digital means to communicate, connect, create and share. I wonder if any of the speakers have got a view on that.
Well, I'm going to offer a sort of contrary view in some ways, because, and the reason I'm doing that is there will of course be burnout. I mean, I am dying to hug another person who is not my partner at this point. I mean, if there's one wish I have for 2021, it's a very simple wish, and don't get me wrong, I care about him a great deal, but really it's nearly a year of shielding at this point. At the same time, who have we been able to listen to and center through these digital infrastructures that we have not been able to listen to and center before? People who are disabled, people who have been confined, to being indoors for many different reasons, people from around the world. Just the fact that we're having conversations like this that we may not otherwise have been able to do, or we may not have thought to do. Conversations in translation to the piece around language. I'm not a huge Zoom fan, but I will tell you one thing I'm a huge fan of is the interpretation feature, because it has allowed many of us to have conversations with simultaneous translation that allow people to speak in their languages. One of the things I often have to remind folks is that if someone is speaking in an English you do not understand well, it's because they speak more languages than you, most likely. It's not that they're stupid, they just have access to other languages. And the internet, in terms of content, is woefully monolingual. I mean, 60% of all content on the internet is in English, but voice allows us that polyvocality, both, practically as well as metaphysically. And so I think I just want to remind us of that, of what it has offered us, at the same time as recognizing, yes, I think we are all very tired of the Zoom box, and we will have, I think, a return to some version of the physicality. What I would be very interested in seeing is how we imagine a future that is multiple and potentially hybrid.
Well, it's a good tee up, because that is my question, which is to pose. I mean, academics usually hate questions about getting a crystal ball out to sort of gaze into the future and think about what happens next. But it does strike me that as we start to even contemplate what a post-pandemic world starts to emerge as, how will future generations look back on this moment in terms of, I guess, all as professors of the human experience in one way or another? How do you think we come out of this pandemic in terms of the way we're going to look at it, in terms of what it potentially teed up next?
I think maybe if I can just say something really quickly, I think I want to say that for the future will probably bring us a perspective that allows us to not think of ourselves as singular, people, that we have to think of ourselves within participants within a collective that represents diversity and multiplicity in languages. The one thing that we've learned in this pandemic is that most of us, whether or not we like to be alone, we no longer like to be just on our own, and that there are a multitude of voices out there, and that the fact that we have had to be alone for so long has allowed us to hopefully understand the importance of all those other voices that surround us, the communities that make up our lives, and the voices that are represented in those communities. And so I think that going forward, everything that we do will hopefully, have to incorporate those elements, because, we're like an onion, right? We start to lose those layers, and then we come to our bare soul, and we understand that it's very lonely in that perspective, and that it doesn't offer us a lot. I mean, at least for me, I feel that it's very lonely, and even though I like it, it's still very lonely to not think of myself as a member of a larger community who has a lot to contribute. But my hands are tied, right, because of this of the situation that we're living in.
And it is interesting that in the world that we're living in at the moment, that if you take the daily news digest, is that the focus on science and medicine and answers that speak to cures. But we're now seeing the glimpses of everything that lives under that, in terms of the social and economic and political costs of that, in terms of what it means for people and their lives. And I wonder whether there is a perspective here in terms of, well, how does that shape the teaching of humanities, the study, the research of humanities going forward? I mean, it feels like there's going to be an immense to-do list that comes out of this, in terms of how we seek understanding about a very, very different world that we're moving into, compared to potentially the one we left behind pre the pandemic.
We have lost a tremendous opportunity if we don't take up that challenge. And so, I appreciate Anasuya's reminder that there are brutal gifts here, that it's our responsibility to take up and take forward. But I think your question, Michael, relates to the last one too, in which I would say that that new appreciation of embodiment and of community in different ways needs to, exist as a through line here, with some understanding that there are prismatic views on, on a collective reality that our systems need to better support. In my sphere, we know that we need to change the makeup of library and ed tech professions as we, apply these lessons and use these brutal gifts. And so we've got to think about how we invest in broadening access and, getting the decolonial project of new libraries adequately informed and off the ground, all the while that we support the welfare of our own staff and of that broader number of people that whose voices have to be heard and who have to be in roles to help shape. So, access and inclusion can't just be about the end users. We've also missed an opportunity there if we're not putting the people of our library systems, the people, the technologists, into deep and co-equal partnership with the communities that they think that they are trying to serve. And so, absent that meaningful conversation, we're not going to get to the transfer of knowledge and understanding that's so necessary for growth. We're not going to get to any real release and sharing and transfer of power. And we're never going to get to the deep kind of interdependency that I hope is a realization of COVID, really of Ubuntu, and that the acknowledgement that I am because you are. And there I have to thank my colleague Bessie Muhanja for helping me grasp the true meaning of that word. But that's what the work is meant to foster.
Brilliant. We're rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to ask for two final comments. Anasuya and Rupi, if I could let you speak finally, and then unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up what is such a fascinating conversation. But Anasuya, your final thoughts, perhaps.
I think humanities, whether we're thinking of that as a discipline or as a value, is so rooted in imagination, right? The critical aspect of it that in discipline is different from the social sciences and the sciences, is in imagination and creativity. And if we do not learn that we have to center the imaginations of those we have not centered so far, both from a human perspective and the Anthropocene, right? Like there is a way in which COVID has also taught us that we are connected much beyond human sentience. And so if we do not recognize that, then I think we will be, exactly as Bethany just said, I think we will have missed a tremendous opportunity. I mean, we have to ask ourselves the questions all the time: who's in the room, who's not in the room, whose scholarship, whose expertise are we reading or listening to? There are just 25 Black women professors in the UK. What does that mean for what scholarship looks like and imagination looks like in UK Academy, right? And there are, of course, other figures from the US. So I think there's something about seeing our full humanity and seeing the full sentience of our lives that COVID has laid bare, but also given us an extraordinary opportunity to reimagine. Dreaming is a form of planning, so I'm hoping that's where we'll go.
Love that. Dreaming is a form of planning. Somebody tweet that. Right, Rupi, your final thoughts.
You should have let me go last, because I'm such a pessimist. I hope that all of these beautiful visions and suggestions are realized. I think people are going to be running back to do exactly what they did before and be as selfish and as sort of I don't know, just as selfish as they have been before. And I think what that means now is that those of us who want to do this work and want to see this world, this is the time for us to form our communities and gather our strength and be prepared to make these beautiful visions that my co-panelists have articulated.
No, but I think points well made. And I think it's just got me thinking how important the humanities, they always have been, but I mean, right now, the study of the humanities and where it goes has never been more vital, never been more pressing, never more fiercely urgent than I think it is right now. Because I think for a lot of people, Rupi, that if the end result is that everything does collapse back inwards, that will be the lost opportunity. And I think a lot of this discussion has been, I think picking up on the signals, but also some of the potential answers in the way forward. And I think the role of universities, and especially universities that study the humanities, not to be just some sort of poor relation to sort of science and medicine, but actually they are mission critical to what comes next. And thank you very much on behalf of everyone I'm sure that's been watching this discussion and giving your time and your expertise and thoughts. Thank you also to everyone that's been watching for joining us. As I mentioned, this is the second of the Open for Discussion discussions. The ones that are coming up, so just dates for your diary. 18th of March is Unlocking Collections. On the 22nd of April, there are two discussions, transnational perspectives on building a post-COVID society. May, there'll be one on open cities, and June, there will be opening the doors to a more engaged humanities. And judging from the announcement of our Prime Minister last night, June is the date we can all get back together. So who even knows, we might not even need digital access to achieve that last one, but that's for Jane and team, I'm sure. But all it realizing for me to say now is thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. Thank you very much for your questions and chat. Do continue the conversation on social. I know there's been a lot of Twitter discussion about it, and thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure to actually bring this discussion and moderate it today. Thank you.